Danbi is of Mi'kmaq citizen from Newfoundland, Canada. He's passionate about developing Indigenous-led initiatives that provide strategies to enhance positive social and economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples. He attains this by providing resources and action plans tied to measurable indicators. Danbi has a lot of experience in the impact space, and I'm hoping he'll talk about that, and I'm hoping you'll ask questions about that. We met Danbi through a colleague of ours, my work husband Simon Lambert, who ended up in Canada. And we had, as you can tell from Aroha's conversation, a really impassioned conversation in Canada about the role of environmental not-for-profits, the pros and cons of working with them for Indigenous people. Danbi has experience in that space as the Director of Impact and Learning at Teach for Canada and as a research assistant with Ryerson University in partnership with the Yellowhead Institute. I hope that you enjoy his conversation. I know we will, and you have some really good questions to ask him. Danbi, can I ask you to come up?
Kia ora. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor and privilege to be up here as the keynote speaker tonight. Kia ora to the Matua and Melanie Mark Shabat for inviting me to New Zealand and to be a part of this crazy and ambitious conference. I would like to also acknowledge the Papatakunya Nuka, the Ranui, the Whari, and the Ngāti Toa, whose land we are on. I can't help but say this again. I'm truly honored to be here with you all. For the last few years, I've had a goal of visiting and learning from New Zealand, and I'm here, a very long way from home. Fun fact, when my fiance learned that I had been invited to attend and speak at a conference titled Crazy and Ambitious, she told me, you know, I always found you to be crazy and ambitious. You're always constantly working on multiple projects, you're always falling asleep in our home office, and if you're not falling asleep at your desk, you're definitely raiding the fridge to fuel yourself and keep yourself awake late at night. So I smiled and I told her, thank you, love. I wouldn't have it any other way. For context, I'm here on behalf of Ryerson University, like Melanie had mentioned, which is located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Currently, I work part-time as a research assistant in partnership with the Yellowhead Institute. And I also, with the Yellowhead Institute, Maori researchers from the Lincoln University, and the Maori Biosecurity Network. In addition to my part-time role at Ryerson, I'm also a student in my third year studying public administration and Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. And from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, I am also the Director of Impact and Learning at a nonprofit organization called Teach for Canada. That's a lot on the go, right? That's why my partner calls me crazy and ambitious. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about how Indigenous-led initiatives provide opportunities to enhance positive outcomes for Indigenous communities, referencing a Mi'kmaq Indigenous teaching and a guiding principle I will tell you about, and how those two are married together, a Western approach to sciences with Indigenous knowledge, and how they can form a decolonizing approach to tackling environmental and social challenges. So tonight I will share three things with you. The first, a bit about myself and my passion in working for and with Indigenous peoples, and why I believe an Indigenous guiding principle known as two-eyed seeing is applicable to the sciences. The second point tonight I'll share with you is shedding light on the importance of honoring and adopting Indigenous knowledge and describing how it can be lived. And my third point tonight is describing an example of how two-eyed seeing is having positive impacts towards environmental and social challenges in Canada. So I did have some slides up here. Hopefully they'll appear for you shortly and give you a little bit of context into what I'm speaking about. The first part that I'm going to introduce now is a little bit about myself and my passion and why I would like to provide you with a brief introduction. So again, my name is Danbi Cho. I am a Mi'kmaq, which is First Nations, and I'm also Chinese-Canadian, born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So there was a picture of the Toronto skyline here, so I'm going to ask and see, can I have a show of hands to see how many have visited Toronto before in the audience? It's a good amount. It's a good amount. And can I get a show of hands of how many people have visited Canada in general? Even larger amount, that's great. Fantastic, I'm glad to see some people have had the opportunity to visit my homelands. So now back to telling you a bit about myself and how I've come to understand the importance of honoring and adopting traditional Indigenous knowledge. So on my mother's side, I have Indigenous roots in Atlantic Canada, and our people are known as the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq are Indigenous peoples who are among the original inhabitants in the Atlantic provinces of Canada, and I am a member of the Whānau-ā-Apanui First Nation. So searching and researching have been central to my journey of decolonization and self-discovery of my history, culture, and my family roots. It's important to note that Canada's acknowledgement of my existence as an Indigenous man did not come naturally or easily. If Indian policy in Canada had fulfilled its goals, my ancestors and I would now be extinct, and I would not be here presenting to you today. So growing up as a mixed race, Mi'kmaq Chinese Canadian, I really found it difficult to identify with my culture in Toronto. It wasn't until my teenage years when my grandmother on my mother's side started telling me about our Mi'kmaq roots and the history of our family. Once I had learned that my family's history, identity, and language had almost been wiped out from Canada's colonial Indian Act and the residential school system, my passion in life became about embarking on a journey to decolonize myself, learn more about what it means to be First Nations and Indigenous person in Canada, and seek out a career in working with Indigenous peoples across the country to develop and carry out projects to provide strategies to enhance positive social economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples across the country. So my journey in working with Indigenous peoples have provided me with so many enriching opportunities to connect with my Indigenous roots and to learn with others of the distinct, unique, and powerful teachings that many other nations have to offer. It's honestly been the foundation to my process of decolonization and self-discovery. I have learned so much, and I'm so grateful to be here today with you all to share some of what I've learned during my journey. With that said, I enjoy introducing people to new ideas and different ways of thinking. In my research, I often find myself trailblazing, cutting through ideologies, attitudes, and structures which are ingrained in Western Euro-colonial thought. This makes the path for First Nations and Indigenous self-determination difficult, even impassable at times. I set a specific set of experiences based on my culture, heritage, geographical, and political environment. However, it's important to note that I speak truth from my own position, experiences, and perspectives, and I do not represent the Indigenous voices of Canada. So to summarize my keynote tonight, my main message and second point is about the importance of honoring and adopting Indigenous knowledge, and specifically speaking about an Indigenous guiding principle I discovered several years ago. This guiding principle is known as Etawaptamuk, which in the Mi'kmaq language means two-eyed seeing. It's important to tell you a little bit about this guiding principle, how it came to life, and who is responsible for bringing it forward to enrich the sciences. So the First Nation teaching was brought into the integrative science space by a Mi'kmaq elder by the name of Albert Marshall in 2004. Albert lives in the community of Eskilsonia, Nova Scotia, in the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq. Albert is the leading environmental voice in Unaki, Cape Breton, and he is the elder and advisor to many, and is a highly regarded spokesperson for natural resources and environmental issues. So the guiding principle in Indigenous knowledge is a teaching that I use both in my personal and professional life. Now you're probably wondering, what is two-eyed seeing? Maybe some have heard about it before, and that's fantastic though. I wonder, is anybody familiar with Etawaptamuk, two-eyed seeing, this guiding principle from the east coast of Canada? So not one person. So then I have a lot to share with you. So now, two-eyed seeing is essentially acknowledging both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems as equally significant and diverse paradigms. Two-eyed seeing has been utilized and found to be relevant as a practice for research, education, health, and within environmental science. So as society is attempting to drive forward with reconciliation in Canada and respond to environmental and social challenges, it's important to learn from Indigenous-based knowledge that has been built over generations. So by examining our relationship with the lands and waters of which Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are part of, Elder Albert Marshall urges for a reconsideration of how society frames the management of our interactions with the natural world and all human life. What's interesting is that Albert Marshall indicates that two-eyed seeing is not easily to convey to academics. It does not fit into any particular subject area or discipline. Rather, it is about life, what you do, what kind of responsibilities you have, and how you should live while on earth. So two-eyed seeing is about recognizing that there are different ways of looking at the world, ultimately finding strength in both the Western scientific ways and Indigenous ways, and mindfully bringing those strengths together while drawing upon the deep understanding that they represent. So similar to those that believe in this guiding principle, I feel that what we have learned as Indigenous peoples are extremely valuable, and I also believe that processes brought and introduced by Western sciences are also valuable in today's world as well. So by bringing together these two-eyed seeing, we can enrich environmental science by looking simultaneously through two lenses, expressing two worldviews. Previously, I had a slide up here I want to show you, but it was about, think about it this way for a moment. In Western science, trees are photosynthesizing beings, right? So originally I had a slide up here that showed a tree and the whole photosynthesis process beyond that. And then with an Indigenous way of looking at a tree, it's perhaps that seeing trees as, teachers, as, trees with lessons for us to learn from. So in that sense, with this thinking, addressing environmental and social challenges with traditional Indigenous knowledge, oh, here we go. So this is my heritage and my Indigenous roots. So for those who've been to the east coast of Canada, when I was talking about that point in time, that's where my family is from, on the southern tip of Newfoundland there. And so at Whānau-ā-Apanui, two-eyed seeing guiding principle was introduced by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall in 2004. As you can see, there's a good illustration of how two-eyed seeing is offering two different lenses there. So this is the image I was looking for. So thinking about it for a moment, in Western science, trees are photosynthesizing beings, and an Indigenous way of looking at it is perhaps seeing trees as teachers with lessons. With this thinking, addressing environmental and social challenges with traditional Indigenous knowledge by utilizing a two-eyed seeing approach is leading to positive outcomes, which I will then talk about in a little bit, especially now that Canadians are embracing collaborative approaches. I heard somebody speaking about it earlier, and it's so true that New Zealand is definitely leading in terms of the relationships between the Māori and the other citizens of New Zealand. In Canada, however, unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, the relationships are not as strong, and Indigenous knowledges and knowing ways of being and doing are not always recognized. And so from my short time of already being here in New Zealand, I've noticed that it's, two-eyed seeing is already being embraced, and it warms my heart to see so. Now in Canada, as science attempts to solve and save the environment and natural world, two-eyed seeing brings an opportunity. That opportunity is for change and attitude and a mindset by honoring and learning of ways to include Indigenous knowledge into environmental science. Ironically, Western scientific evidence is now saying what our Indigenous peoples have been expressing for a long time, and that is our environment and life as we know it is in danger. And in Canada, many regions and Indigenous communities are full of pollutants, and our waters and lands are poisoned. Our forests are burning, and certain animals are facing extinction. That being said, many folks are aware, and not all are in denial of the environmental challenges Canada is faced with, despite what some of our politicians may say. There are a lot of groups who wish to support Indigenous peoples and their communities in Canada in addressing environmental concerns, and it ranges from NGOs, all levels of government, corporations, and various philanthropists. Their interests lie within offering interventions focused on addressing a variety of inequalities, such as environmental conservation and ethical development on Indigenous lands. However, sometimes these groups who wish to make improvements within these communities are actually having negative impacts. So devaluing communities by not including Indigenous knowledge and the voice of the people. So which then leads to a weakening of their self-determination, sovereignty, and rights. So this is where two-eyed seeing comes into play. By honoring and adopting Indigenous knowledge, we can encourage people to learn to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and to learn to see from the other eye with the strengths in the mainstream Western or Eurocentric knowledges of ways of knowing. And most importantly, to learn to see with both eyes together for the benefit of all. So by utilizing this teaching in Canada, we've learned that we can decolonize the mindset of those who are firmly in the only belief system of Western ways of knowing, learning, and doing. Therefore, two-eyed seeing encourages the realization that beneficial outcomes are much more likely in any given situation if we are willing to bring two or more perspectives into play. However, it's important that I mention that such work is not easy. Therefore, an ongoing journey of co-learning is both required and essential in order to develop the profound collaborative understandings and capabilities that two-eyed seeing encourages. So co-learning requires obviously learning together with and from each other, and that it be ongoing. So in order for co-learning to become just jargon or trivialized or romanticized, Two-eyed seeing requires a weaving back and forth between Western and Indigenous knowledge. So I'm going to do my best here to provide an example by describing a scenario and placing you, the audience, into it. So can I ask everybody to close their eyes for a moment? Just close your eyes for one moment. For those who are visually impaired, please join in as best you can. It's okay. Now that your eyes are closed, Mel, do you have those water balloons? No, just kidding, everybody. For real this time, please keep your eyes closed. Now remember how I mentioned that two-eyed seeing can require a weaving of back and forth between knowledges? Well, Elder Albert recommends that the approach be pictured in the following way. So imagine a heavy sledge, or Thor's hammer for the Marvel fans in the room. Sometimes environmental and social challenges are like a heavy sledge that we are trying to move. This sledge, or Thor's hammer, represents our passions for ensuring the ecological integrity of the nurturing wholeness of this earth, the well-being of our communities, and the transmission of our Indigenous cultures and knowledge. The elders are dragging that sledge with all their might, and at times need others to help by pushing it as hard as they can on the rear of that sledge. But it is the elders who will determine where it goes. Other times, that heavy sledge represents a passion or challenge elders hold that Western sciences can help address. Then, the elders will help you Western scientists with that sledge. You drag this time, the elders push, maintaining movement to ensure it's headed in the direction of the elders intended. So the lesson here is that when ENGOs or governments or others want to work with Indigenous communities to address environmental and social challenges, that it be at the direction of the Indigenous peoples, and that the Indigenous knowledge is to be respected, honored, and adopted to complement the Western scientific ways. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Unless anybody fell asleep, I know it's really late in the afternoon, and then I'm going to really ask Mel to bring out those water balloons. Okay, now that I've taken you on a visual journey, I'd like to move on to my third point, which is sharing an example of how two-eyed seeing is having positive impacts towards tackling environmental challenges. So in Canada, there's a new approach to conservation, and it's called Pathway to Target 1. As noted on their website in 2017, 10.5% of Canada's land and fresh water was conserved, and now through an initiative called Pathway to Canada Target 1, the Pathway team are aiming to conserve at least another 7% by the end of 2020. So what I've learned about Pathway to Target 1 so far is that it's making way for looking at land and water conservation with Indigenous knowledge and a focus on a genuine renewal of how the country can partner with Indigenous peoples to think about environmental protection and relationships. Although it's not publicly recorded, you can see based on the literature and the reports of Pathway to Target 1 Canada that it brings together Indigenous and non-Indigenous environmental experts to share their knowledge and lend their expertise. That being said, Albert Marshall, the man who introduced two-eyed seeing, that guiding principle, is actually one of those Indigenous environmental experts involved in the Pathway to Target 1. The team also includes all levels of government in Canada, Indigenous peoples, private landowners, communities, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector. So really bringing everybody together. So each all have a role to play in protecting Canada's biodiversity. So to bring focus amongst the team, there are three main groups who have contributed to Pathway Target 1. This includes the Indigenous Circle of Experts, the National Advisory Panel, and a National Steering Committee. So Pathway to Target 1 was designed to reflect renewed relationships that respect the rights, responsibilities, and priorities of Indigenous peoples. A key element has been the Indigenous Circle of Experts, and their efforts have led to consider how Indigenous protected and conserved areas can be realized in Canada and contribute to achieving Target 1. So in the spirit and practice of reconciliation, the Indigenous Circle of Experts recommends that there needs to be a paradigm shift in conservation, and that the path toward conservation in lands and waters must be thoughtfully and respectively navigated. So science, legislation, and policies are all continuing to play a guiding role. However, the Indigenous Circle of Experts suggest that Indigenous expertise and knowledge start to become a part of this guidance in both substantive and the methods, thus applying two-eyed seeing. So members of the Indigenous Circle of Experts included a core group of Indigenous experts from across Canada and officials from federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions. The Indigenous Circle of Experts hosted 4 regional gatherings to hear from Indigenous peoples across Canada on the Indigenous protected and conserved areas to inform their recommendations with Indigenous knowledge, local expertise, and methods in Indigenous-led conservation. So the work has resulted in an informed open dialogue, and this image right here is actually of the 121-page report that they have titled We Rise Together. And actually one of the recommendations laid out in the report is that Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science need to be treated as equally valued and respected parallel systems, that they complement each other while maintaining its integrity. This dual system of knowledge, two-eyed seeing, weaves the two approaches together using Indigenous expertise. So from there, the Indigenous Circle of Experts brought together representatives from coast to coast to coast in Canada to determine the recommendations that are laid out in the report. The community is still continuing to work with government, Indigenous communities across Canada, and their role is to provide best recommendations on how to move forward on achieving those targets, such as the 17% protected areas across Canada. So by bringing ideas forward on how it can be achieved, the process includes First Nations perspectives, First Nations-led initiatives, and is determined by the Indigenous Circle of Experts. So this is just but one example of a strong alliance that is applied two-eyed seeing by honoring and implementing traditional Indigenous knowledge to enrich environmental science. I think what's important is that in Canada, we need to strive and remember that we all have an important role to play in taking care of our creation and our environment. And part of this responsibility is to learn from our elders, Amatua, who have maintained relationships with the land and who are able to share their teachings. Our elders are one of our most valuable resources, and we should always have them in mind when we're asking big questions and tackling big challenges. Further to this, our planet is precious, and we all play a role and have a responsibility to look after it. When I learned about the Tiaki Promise here in New Zealand, for example, I was moved. Knowing that it means to care for people and place really moved me in a positive way. The promise is also aligned with my own personal beliefs, and I was really happy to learn about it as I prepared for my travels to be here with you all today. I will take this lesson with me, and I will definitely carry it forward, making a commitment to act as a guardian, protecting and preserving our homelands. So while traveling in New Zealand, I will definitely care for the land, sea and nature, treading lightly and leaving no trace, while traveling safely, showing care and consideration for all, while respecting the culture and traveling with an open heart and an open mind. In closing, let's remember that Etawaptamuk, two-eyed seeing, refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both eyes together for the benefit of all. Furthermore to that, two-eyed seeing encourages the realization that beneficial outcomes are much more likely in any given situation if we're willing to bring two or more perspectives into play. It's important that I mention and demonstrate that I recognize that this Mi'kmaq understanding are only but one view in a multitude of Indigenous views. Similarly, that of Western sciences, the world's cultures, there are tons of understandings, and they all contribute to addressing the local and global challenges faced in efforts to promote healthy communities and ecosystems. Therefore, one might want to talk about four-eyed seeing or 10-eyed seeing, applying multiple Indigenous ways of thinking, knowing, and doing. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you for staying here for this session. I hope you enjoyed my keynote, my antidotes of humor there, and perspectives on enriching the science with Indigenous knowledge. I look forward to networking with you all and answering any of your questions to the best of my ability. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Danbi, and I am going to give him a koha, as we do, but I'm going to allow you to ask him questions first. While I set Danbi up with the handheld mic, I'm going to invite a couple of my colleagues up to the stage as well, so that you can not only ask Danbi questions, but you can ask our team. So our co-founder, Dr. Amanda Black, you can make your way up. Waitangi Wood, who many of you have already seen, and Dr. Shaun Ogilvie, if you could all pop up here as well. Then feel free to ask them questions, if you have any. I wanted to start by following on from what Danbi was saying, and earlier you were talking about some of the differences you've seen between Aotearoa, Shaun's just organising the ladies, between Aotearoa and Canada and the way Indigenous peoples are interacting with the science system, and with your experience with ENGOs. And I thought maybe you could elaborate a wee bit more on that in terms of what you're seeing, what lessons you could take from Aotearoa and what lessons we could take from you. Yeah.
Right now?
Yeah.
Lessons that I can take away.
Yeah. Lessons you can give us as well.
Sorry there. It's I think it's around like 3 in the morning in Toronto right now, so I'm still a bit zoned out right now. But I think some of the lessons are what I made reference there at the end, the Tiaki promise. I think there's a lot to learn from New Zealand, and my friend here next to me, I remember how you made mention that New Zealand is light years ahead, right? And I would agree. We have a lot to learn. The challenge within Canada is that we're such a large country. I mean, just in First Nations in general, we have 630 First Nations from the east coast of Canada to the west coast. Each nation is distinct and unique in their own ways, with their own cultures, protocols, and knows Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. That being said, I think that there's definitely a lot to learn from each other. And one of the things that I'm actually doing, and the reason I'm out here, is I'm working on a project with Mel and some other friends here on how to develop a tool for evaluating environmental NGOs. And in Canada, for example, there's a lot of communities that are just operating on good faith. So they're actually just partnering with a lot of these environmental NGOs based on reputation and not really taking into consideration that some of these environmental NGOs could take away their self-determination, the voice of the people, and interfere in ways that these First Nations are looking to make choices on their own behalf. And what's interesting about that and the work that I'm doing that I'm going to be sharing soon is that an Indigenous approach to evaluating these NGOs haven't been given much thought. And based on the fact that they've operated in good faith, they're really starting to see now that there needs to be an approach in doing so. More of the focus has been on large corporations, of course, around impact benefit agreements and so forth, due to the fact that a lot of those corporations are taking away the resources and the minerals from the land. So it's more of a focus versus evaluating, say, an ENGO who's looking to advocate on their behalf. But to answer your question, Mel, there's definitely a lot to learn, and I feel as though Canada has a lot more to learn from New Zealand than the other way around.
Thank you. Following on from that then, the Indigenous Circle of Experts is a great concept. How well received have their recommendations been?
So far, so good. The report has only been out for over a year now, and it seems as though they've done a good job by including people from coast to coast to coast, meaning that it's not just First Nations people that are included, it's the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and that the fact that they were able to cover a lot of the territories across Canada is speaking volumes as to why the recommendations are now being honored, due to the fact that they did a robust job of ensuring that it wasn't just a certain region's input, it was as best as they can to represent Canada at large.
Oh. And I guess I'm going to move on and ask Amanda a question, and that is around Te Tira Whakamātaki's establishment, and what was going through yours and Nick's head at the time that you established, and did you foresee that Te Tira Whakamātaki would become what it has become and what we're hoping it will be in the future?
Okay, so the first part to that, there's actually multiple questions in that question. I think Nick and I were looking to offload some work. It didn't really work. We were sort of in a strange situation where we were one of the very few in the area. I mean, trying to attempt to, I'd seen, this is kind of the first time I've heard about it, but the concept's pretty familiar, where you're trying to combine the best of both worlds, to solve solutions. But technically, I guess since I wear glasses, it's 4, I'd say. But we had a lot of, I guess, non-Indigenous researchers come to us and ask, what do Māori think in of this biocontrol, or what did they think of this biosecurity issue, and we never had the answers to these questions. And even if we did, we didn't feel like we were the people to represent everyone. You can't just ask one Māori and expect that's the opinion of every Māori. And so we thought, well, we could formulate some sort of rōpū, a group, that we'd be able to have these conversations. So there's also a safe place to have these types of conversations where you're looking at Māori concerns and I guess Māori priorities of some of this research, and then we wouldn't feel like we'd just get fobbed off by mainstream. And so that's how really we came about, and it grew bigger than Ben-Hur, and before you know it, we've become a victim of our own success, really. So instead of having less work, we've got more work and just more work. What was the second part of your question?
Okay, yeah.
It was, what do we see for the future, I think, was the third part. I guess we'd like to see us still being an advocate for solutions-based research for Māori communities, and being an independent voice, or even a platform for Māori communities. A lot of sorry, I'm losing my voice, I've got a hair cold. A lot of the issues were Māori communities weren't able to digest some of the information that came out, or it wasn't readily available. So one thing we did do is we turned it into some sort of terms that they could understand and they could access and explain some of the risks, and also did a lot of the groundwork, I guess, writing up a lot of the proposals and submitting, or writing a lot of the stuff so they could submit on our behalf, and just double checking. We did a lot of stuff in the communities for free, and we still do, and that it's because they're usually under siege by all the government departments. I mean, in government ministries and councils, you have these revolving doors where everyone comes around, and every 2 years Māori communities get asked the same set of questions by a different bunch of people, and they just get really frustrated. And so we've tried to stop that as well by helping both sides out. And I think in the future we'd like to continue doing that, but putting this out in the Pacifica model as well. You were talking about seed banking, and maybe extend this into climate change and other biodiversity issues, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And that leads really nicely into a question I'm probably going to direct towards you, Waitangi, but Amanda can certainly add into, and that is, are you aware of other Indigenous biosecurity networks around the world, and what would it take to connect with groups like that, if there were, to share knowledge and anticipate new and emerging threats to Aotearoa New Zealand?
Okay, yep, I do know about other Indigenous groups. It's not just in the science and research space or biosecurity space or environment space, but also in public health, which is often seen as something outside of what we are doing, but actually it has huge implications in terms of people health and what happens with things coming into the country. I don't think it would be difficult at all, because there's an appetite for it. Indigenous people in those spaces, most of you or some of our people are working with them already, and they just recently, I can think of 2 instances where Māori went to global groups of science. So CTEC is a science, ecotoxicology and chemistry. They have 5 global regions and a cohort of 12 of us with our Aboriginal colleagues, so kaitiaki rangatira, not no one with any science background, went to a highly intense conference where people talked a lot of sciencey things, and we put up a theme, and after a day, our presentation room went from 4 people to 60. And we were able to establish a knowledge and values, traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge and values network through not just the Australia Pacific group, but through all 5 global groups from that one interaction. And there was an appetite from everybody in that room because of the position that Māori and our Australian colleagues took on that. I think it's just really about having the appetite to do that. And even when we went over to Fiji, there are a number of groups across that region. We're having conversations now about what that might look like. Yeah. And in the marine space, there are a group of people who are working, because it's Pacific, and Marine biosecurity is a huge issue for our Pacifica cousins or whānau, and so they're wanting to find ways to talk to each other, and so that's the benefit, I think, of establishing networks. I think the issue is not to over-network. I think it's about not keep creating isolated networks on networks. I think the whole idea around a network is not to be specific, but to have some sort of generalism that allows the commonality of conversations and information to flow in an agile way.
Shaun, I have a question for you. I actually probably have two. One's mine and one's on the app. The question I had for you was, you have been walking the line, the two-eyed view line for a long time between Western science, well, four eyes in your case as well, and Indigenous knowledge. You've been holding that space in some really controversial areas too, in the 1080 space, working with our Tūhoe whanaunga. So how have you balanced that, and how have you alternated between those two worlds?
I think for me, I think the way that it's kind of worked for me is because I'm not afraid to split the world up into little parts and to focus in, I guess, the science side of me, and to focus in on particular things and look at mechanisms about how things work. And I guess that's one of the eyes. But for me, the Indigenous knowledge side of things has been at a higher level. I think that you take your guidance from, you look at the big picture things around how the world works from a higher level. So I don't see a need to say, splitting the world up into parts is an unacceptable practice. For me, it doesn't work like that. I think if we're going to learn mechanisms, we can quite well do that. But the trick is how we bring everything back together again, and I think that's where the knowledge from bigger picture worldviews comes into play. And actually, I looked to Canada, and I talked to Danbi about this morning, actually, but when I was in Canada some time back, and I spent a bit of time with a knowledgeable elder, I'll call him over there, called Dan Longboat, and he raised this concept, which I think a lot of people have used since, I've heard since, but it's the concept of re-indigenising humanity. And I think that we need to be thinking about, especially with all this, there's been a lot of it today in the discussions around, we're basically we're living in a house that's catching fire, right? And so I think there's an opportunity within that concept of re-indigenising humanity to be thinking about, what do we do to reconnect with nature, and what are the things that we can be thinking about to make that connection. And so I guess, for me, I don't see that separation between the two eyes. To me, it's about, we can do science, and we can do science in whatever manner kind of suits us, and we can learn a lot from those processes. But at the end of the day, it's how we bring those back into bigger picture thinking about how we live together on our planet and survive. That kind of brings it together. So, that's the way I see it anyway.
Oh, and can I follow that up with, can you give an example of your, or your favourite example of two-eyed seeing for you personally, something that's enriched your work-life blur?
Well, I think I look to James over here, James Waiwai, and we've been involved a lot in the past in quite controversial work around the use of 1080 and protection of taonga species. And actually, this is just getting into one of tomorrow's panels. But anyway, I guess that's kind of how it's going to work. But and I hope James doesn't mind me saying this, but we had a congress back in 2003, and James did a presentation with Dr. John McLennan around the Kiwi protection program. And so we're doing all this hard work about how we remove the predators for the kiwi, and there's a lot of quite reductionist science in there. And then someone put out their hand and asked James the question, why is the kiwi important to you? And James asked Dr. John, should I tell him the real story? Should I tell him the real story? And Dr. John said, yeah, you tell him the real story. And so we went from this position of how do we protect the kiwi and a lot of science, then to this question of, well, why is the kiwi important? And James brought up the story, whakapapa story, that the kiwi actually, the kiwi Shall I tell a story, James? I'm going to tell a story, okay. So if we go right back to early Māori descriptions of where everything came from, Hiniahuone is the first female, okay, and so Tāne Mahuta shaped the first female in One. It was the red ochre, and shaped the first female, and then he breathed life into her nose, and she came to being. And so at that point, you might have heard the saying "Tihei mauri ora," which is "I sneeze, it is life." So she sneezed into life, and she was the first female form. And being the first female form, Tāne had the first male response to the beautiful female form. And so he naturally wanted to mate with the first female form. And that had never happened before, so he didn't know what that process entailed. And so he connected with, I guess, what we would consider as humans, the incorrect parts of her body. So he ended up in here at one stage, and that was where the Kiwi came into being, okay? And then he made his way around the various parts of the female form and eventually got to what we would consider to be the correct place where humans came from. And then from this story, there's from that creation story, that's where hupe comes from. Hupe, that's the mucus from your nose and your earwax. But anyway, the important part of that story is that the Kiwi came into being before humans, okay? And so that is what motivates the people of Tūhoe to put a lot of work in voluntarily, and that gets back to something that Arawa was saying, a lot of volunteer work to protect the Kiwi. And so getting back to the concept of the connection getting back to the concept of the two-eyed seeing, well, within that concept, that bigger picture is that in the scheme of things, in the scheme of things on the planet, we're humans that actually we need to consider that these other things around us are actually more important. So that's the story there. So that's
your
a really important favourite story that I've got in terms of working in science, but also protecting taonga species.
Cool. And before we wrap it up and make two announcements after, and you all get to your drinks soon, I'm just going to open it to Amanda, Waitangi and Danbi to tell us either one of their favourite examples of two-eyed seeing, or working in both spaces. Amanda obviously worked in both spaces in the Kauri world. Have you got an example?
Yeah, I guess...
Or did Monica steal it?
What's that?
Or did Monica steal it in her presentation?
No, she's welcome to it. No, to think. It's a couple of, I guess Monica's is the most tangible project that we can talk about today, and you've heard about it. So, but it's basically, it's mātauranga led by Discovery, looking for a potential management solution for Kauri dieback, and the rongo practitioners that we work with, they choose the plants based on their knowledge and the whakapapa of the plant assemblages with kauri. And so instead of us going around and collecting hundreds of plants and kind of doing high throughput screening of like loads and loads of samples, they've managed to narrow it down. And even though we can't say what we've got successful so far because of our collective agreement, but it's certainly very promising. It's more promising than any other chemicals that we've tested so far today. Can I safely say that without getting in trouble? Okay, cool. Too late now. And that's been a really neat process because it's taken very sciencey science, if that's such a thing, very lab, biochemistry, microbiology type science, and everyone's got this image of scientists in their white lab coats hidden away in the lab. And it's also, we've got rongo practitioners who just spend all their time nearly in the forest and don't really come out. Only when they have to come to Wellington, we have a group meeting. And so it's kind of neat and it's worked out, and we have practical solutions. We're coming out with practical solutions for a part of Kauri dieback. It's like one of the 20 magic bullets that we'll need. But another one I think is, using, again, Kauri dieback as an exemplar. I have no problem doing science and compartmentalising sites, but it's how you reassemble that and the context that you do it in. And you be empathetic and sympathetic to the communities you're working with. So instead of going away doing the science and here's the solution, you go away and do the science and you implement it in a way that is sympathetic and empathetic to the people that you're working with. I think that's and their management systems. It's not necessarily the management system that we have at the moment that's working, but looking back to how they would naturally manage an ecosystem and bringing it back to their unit. And just, I mean, two-eyed seeing or just taking the best of both worlds, I think, to come up with a solution. So that's my experience.
Why
Too much.
Your turn.
Rude. No.
Yes.
So I've got two.
She has,
So
that's Waitangi.
so
That's good.
it's a little bit about Monica wanted to find some sort of. We had a conversation about potentially what could be a mātauranga solution to her work that she could test that was informed by our traditional knowledge. And I had this scenario where I have two daughters, and in her father's family, obviously not mine, but in her father's family, they have asthma and eczema. And one daughter has asthma and one has eczema. And I was talking to my mum about it, and she said to me, well, dear, it's because, that's because of the genealogy. So they've got, your resistance, something's happened with your genealogy, and so we call whakapapa. And so based on the conversation that potentially one child has got resistance to asthma and one doesn't present with eczema, I had this conversation with my mum about whakapapa and the potential solution to Cody. And potentially, if the brother or sister of Cody could have a resistance to Cody dieback. So that was the constant conversation. And Matua, Kevin Prime and I went on a little bit of a hikoi. I'm not name dropping, but I just want to say so that we went on a bit of a hikoi to discover who the mother of Cody was. And that in itself was this idea around where you would utilise Māori in a way that complements the way in which science want to identify your context of two-eyed. Yeah. So we found the mother, I want to tell you that, and it was an interesting conversation, and it was actually from Tūhoe Ashby who had that kōrero for us. And we didn't actually take it anywhere, but it was a wonderful hikoi, so we're using that up home ourselves for those sorts of conversations. And then the second one is about the social licence conversation. We constantly don't look at Māori being involved or having this context of using traditional knowledge as a way to create social licence or to encourage Māori to be involved in science kaupapa or biosecurity responses. So up north we have huge programs that look at looking after the Kiwi. But for our hapu, we see that as we support the Pākehā communities to do that because they do a great job. And resourcing is given to them to do that, and so we're quite happy for that to occur. We've got whānau along our coastline that also support Kiwi projects and initiatives, and we're happy with that to occur. But my own hapu, I could never ever get them involved in any pest management type of program because as far as they were concerned, that was being done by everybody else. And Kiwi, even though we have a kōrero around whakapapa to it, it wasn't really of huge interest to my whānau, if I can say that. And one day we were sitting outside our marae during the day, and we have a taonga species, it's a little white owl. And during the day, and we were sitting there, and we looked up, and in our pahutakawa tree, it was just sitting on a branch, which was really unusual, because one was during the day, and two, our marae is out in the open. It's not far from the bush, but it was what we call those a tohu, a sign or an indicator of something. And everyone was delighted to see our white rudu, our little rudu, and someone said, well, I haven't heard them for a little while. And then someone said, why is that? What do you think that is? And someone said, do you think it's got to do with those possums you keep talking about? And all of a sudden, possums have to die. And it's become a major kōrero, and I think that that's one of the things that we, in terms of this conversation, is that quite often we look nationally at what things are of interest, and we focus a lot on that. But if you talk to Māori or those people from those communities, the same results you want that allow for community cohesion and action can be founded in the things where Māori hold something sacred and important. Yeah.
Kia ora, Waitangi, and Danbi.
I have 2 minutes in the orange sign here. Let's see what I can do in 2 minutes.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Oh, it's okay. I'll be quite quick. Here we go. So my favorite story is about what I've been doing for the last year, and that's determining how to figure out how to evaluate NGOs, and for the last couple months, ENGOs. And that process has been really, really quite the learning experience. I've been learning from both, Western methodologies and Indigenous methodologies. My research has been involved with more so at the organization Teach for Canada, because the organization is partnered with 19 First Nations. That being said, I've been working very closely with 19 First Nations chiefs, elders, and various First Nation administration to determine how do we evaluate a nonprofit in an Indigenous paradigm. And what I've come to learn is that in the Western space, obviously a logic model is utilized quite often. And within the Indigenous space is that there's actually one that's a logic model that's very similar, except it's based on an Ojibwe methodology of looking at a living tree versus a dead tree analogy, in the sense that if you were to take it a logic model, you would use this tree and it would be your logic model, except it would be from a bottoms-up approach where the roots are the grandfathers, the grandmothers, and then that's the inputs, the trunks are the activities, and then the branches are the outputs, which are, short, medium, and long-term. And it's been really interesting to see that there's actually a similarity there that's obviously influenced by Western knowledge of how to evaluate activities that are taking place in community. And then that being said, it's then led into the work that I've been doing with the Maori Biosecurity Network around how do we develop a tool for evaluating environmental NGOs. And so for the last couple months, having engaged with First Nations leaders to hear about what process is it that we should do and what kind of tool would be best utilized to evaluate an environmental NGO, it's been quite the learning experience to draw upon both Western methods and Indigenous methods. And that being said, I think that the fact that there are two different logic models that are coming from both was quite fascinating to find for me.
Kia ora, thank